This is a review of the African past, examining an area which educational programs have generally tended to ignore. Our purpose is to inspect some of the now abundantly available facts which can be utilized to advantage by students in particular and the public in general. My name is Thelma Harris, here to initiate this review and to introduce Professors James Campbell and Lewis Thompson, both like myself instructors and lecturers in African history. Our work of the past several years, we suggest, can be as enlightening to others as we find this subject to be. In the ensuing presentation, we bring into focus some questions that have been prominent since our close collaboration began. Between the years 1834 and 1908, there occurred a revolution in academic thinking about Africa's place in the outlines of world geography and world history. And in the past 150 years, European explorers and archaeologists have found in the valleys of the Niger, Benue, Limpopo, and Nile rivers, in the basin of Lake Chad and the Sahara, extensive remains of hundreds of ruins which bear witness to the existence of former civilizations of hundreds and thousands of years ago. This knowledge of the facts about the African past, when combined with the known history of other continents, reveals that these also are the stories of the triumphs and failures of mankind and form many enlightening chapters in the history of the human race. In this series of recordings, we have selected several areas for presentation with a generous interspersing of points of reference for further research. And in consideration of the usefulness of divisions in the study of history, we have chosen three that are clear, exact, and we believe appropriate. First, archaeological history, which is information about very old objects that have either been found on the surface of the earth or dug up out of the earth. Such objects have been scientifically examined and analyzed, the date of their origin established, and their significance and importance explained. Second, recorded history. That information which is written down as a record of events that have taken place or are supposed to have taken place. Such information is usually calculated to preserve in memory the political exploits and cultural achievements of the people concerned. And third, traditional history. This is the unwritten account of a people's acts, achievements, and vicissitudes, more or less consciously transmitted to succeeding generations in terms of especially significant events, either orally in songs, ballads, and poetry, pictorially as in painting and drawings, or dramatically as in the dance. The music which accompanies the dance and which is an integral part of the song is necessarily to be considered also an aspect, a most important one indeed, of traditional history. By this arrangement, the persons, places, and things alluded to are placed in a certain logical order, and the circumstances, sequences, and consequences of events are made abundantly clear. History is not merely a record of past events, but when put on a time scale, relative or absolute, it seeks to imply historical causality. That is to say, later events do not influence earlier events, but earlier events can influence later ones. For, as it is said, the value of history lies not in the multitude of facts collected, but in their relation to each other. It would seem most appropriate then to begin with archaeological history, since the earliest existence of mankind can be traced only on the basis of fossilized evidence and artifacts. Would you agree, Mr. Campbell?
Yes, I do agree, Mrs. Harris. The science of prehistory does depend upon the discoveries of the archaeologist, and though much of prehistory is hypothesized, it seeks to answer such questions as where was the fabled Garden of Eden? When and where did living things and human life first appear on earth? Who built the first human civilization? For centuries, these questions have been raised in the minds of poets, philosophers, and myth-makers among most of the world's peoples. Specifically, the Athenians thought the first man sprouted from Attic soil. The ancient Hebrews and their spiritual descendants were of the opinion that Adam, the supposed primal parent of mankind, was made in the Garden of Eden in 6 days after the foundation of the world. According to Pindar the poet, the ancient Libyans believed that Iarbas, the earliest man, sprang into existence in the heart of Libya. Ancient Egyptians contended that it was in their country, the oldest in the world, that the gods fashioned the first of all human beings out of a handful of mud moistened by the life-giving waters of the blessed Nile. Likewise, creation stories have come from many other parts of Africa, such as Ethiopia, Tanzania, formerly known as Tanganyika, Rhodesia, Congo, Ghana, and Nigeria. Now, one of the oldest of such stories told by Africans to account for the origin and early development of man and his culture survives in a Greek version of the thesis first advanced by the ancient Cushites, who were more widely known in antiquity as the Ethiopians. Now, this remarkable people flourished in olden times in the region called Cush, the Hebrew scriptures, and is marked on present-day maps as the Republic of Sudan and the Ethiopian Empire. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that the Cushites were of the opinion that their country was not only the birthplace of the human race and the cradle land of the world's earliest civilization, but indeed the primal Eden where living things first appeared on earth. Thus, Diodorus was the first European to focus attention on the Cushite claim that tropical Africa was the cradle land of the world's earliest civilization and the original Eden of the human race.
Isn't it true, Professor Campbell, that since Diodorus focused attention on this Cushite claim, many students and scholars have sought to discover evidence to settle the question of the origin of man? And don't the recent discoveries of the eminent British archaeologist Dr. Louis S.B. Leakey support the claims of the ancient Cushites?
Yes, Mrs. Harris. During the last few years, East Africa has become the focal point of all students of human evolution. Now, it is true, of course, that sites of human habitation of great antiquity have also been found in Asia, but those in Africa are the oldest found anywhere. Now, let us digress for a moment and consider what goes into the work of an archaeologist and scholar. Mr. Thompson here has researched this area and has made interesting observations. Mr. Thompson, would you enlighten us, please?
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. It is helpful to examine some of the preliminaries and requirements that do exist in the field of archaeology, and especially since we are about to discuss Dr. Leakey's finds. The archaeologist, in furtherance of the universal interest in the origin of man, attempts to establish the chronology of his findings. Institutions of higher learning, such as the University of California, Oxford, MIT, Cambridge, Harvard, archaeological and geological societies, the Smithsonian Institution, the National Geographical Society, sovereign governments such as Great Britain, Egypt, the United States, Tanzania, and Kenya, and private parties support these undertakings and thereby make a valuable contribution to our ever-increasing storehouse of knowledge about the human race. In many cases, archaeologists have drawn upon ancient stories and myths for leads that have unearthed important specimens. Speaking of leads, Dr. Leakey is reported to have received much inspiration from the works of Darwin. Similarly, Heinrich Schliemann, in his search for Troy, was inspired by the work of Homer, the Greek poet. When the leads are felt to be secure, then the hard work begins. At once we can see that the archaeologist must be a historian as well as a geologist, who, according to the definition, is conversant with a science which treats the history of the earth and its life, especially as recorded in the rocks. Therefore, he must utilize the principles of physics, astronomy, mineralogy, zoology, botany, and chemistry. In other words, the undertaking must be done by very learned persons who understand what they are about. In some cases, the search is of short duration. In others, it is long and difficult. In any event, financial backing is necessary in order to lay in provisions, provide transportation and shelter, secure tools and instruments, obtain helpers, and negotiate permission to conduct operations in the specified area. These preparations, plus a deep sense of conviction, fortify the archaeologist for the exciting adventure which lies ahead. So we should not brush aside lightly the uncovering of petrified bones or the finding of ancient tombs, cities, and other artifacts.
Indeed, it was largely through the dedicated work of Dr. Leakey that new discoveries have been made in Africa. Leakey first began his systematic investigation of Stone Age cultures in Kenya in 1926. Having been born in Kenya in 1903, he grew up with the Kikuyu people, from whom he learned many things which later helped him in his work as an archaeologist. He learned to speak their language before he learned English, and at 13, Leakey officially became a member of the Kikuyu tribe. Dr. Leakey studied at Cambridge University. He later became curator of Corridon Museum at Nairobi, a post that he held until 1961. When Leakey began his exploration of the prehistory of East Africa in the Naivasha-Nakuru Lake Basin of the Rift Valley, he made so many new discoveries that he was able to publish a book in 1931, which he called The Stone Age Cultures of Kenya Colony. In this work, he describes the existence in Kenya of the hand axe culture. Leakey wrote another book, which he published in 1935, The Stone Age Race of Kenya. In this book, he discusses some of the early human remains which he discovered. Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, about 300 miles southwest of Nairobi, the place where the fossil of the earliest man was discovered, is just west of the eastern branch of the Rift Valley. Now, according to the dictionary, a rift valley is caused by a down faulting or lowering of a base. Geologists have found that this particular valley extends for more than 5,000 miles to the north and into Asia, from the Zambezi River to the Jordan River. The Rift Valley averages 40 miles across, and its floor lies about 1,500 feet below the general level of the surrounding country. Now, Olduvai Gorge was not always a gorge. A couple of million years ago, the area was a lakeshore. Man and animals came there to get water. The bones of some that died there were covered when the lake rose. For thousands of years, silt and sand was carried into the lake by muddy streams, and this silt and sand was slowly deposited on top of those remains and eventually dried up, leaving the bones buried under several hundred feet of silt. Over the centuries, as the silt compressed into rock, the bones hardened into stones and became fossils. Now the sides of Olduvai Gorge are stratified into layers like a slice of cake. And the stories told in those layers can be read almost as clearly as the pages of a history book by those who know how.
Professor Campbell, I note that most of the fossilized remains of the earliest man have been found near rivers or in lake basins. Please tell us why early man tended to stay near those bodies of water when the African continent is so vast.
Let us consider the fact that until man learned how to carry and store water, he could not stay long away from freshwater streams and lakes. The early Stone Age man of the Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya area lived for many hundreds of thousands of years within reach of many of the sources of both the Congo and the Nile rivers. Now, hunting and fishing along those streams, searching for food, early man gradually became acquainted with a wider area. Not only did he live by lakes to obtain his water supply, but animals would also concentrate around lakes and waterholes, and man, therefore, followed them to obtain food. In the course of hundreds of thousands of years, through the migration of thousands of Stone Age families, settlements were made along all four major African rivers. The first movements of African Stone Age people into Europe and Asia also took place during this time.
Yes, speaking of the Stone Age, Mr. Thompson here has some information concerning the Stone Age. Mr. Thompson.
The Stone Age is the period of history of mankind which came before the Bronze and Iron Ages. During this period, early man learned to use stone implements and weapons. The Stone Age, a period of time, was subdivided into three periods. The early period, Paleolithic, occurred during the Pleistocene epoch and was marked by the development of bone and flint tools. The second period, Mesolithic, was a transitional phase when early man was moving into the third period, Neolithic. This period was the later part of the Stone Age and was characterized by highly finished or polished stones and by simple agriculture.
About 100,000 years ago, earthquakes changed East Africa's Great Rift Valley. Rains flowing into this huge valley cut deep side gullies into it. Now, one of the gullies became Olduvai Gorge. It is cut through the place where the shore of the ancient lake had once been. Fossilized bones that had lain buried for almost 2 million years were exposed on its sides. Now, by locating and studying these fossils, Dr. Leakey was able to get some idea of what life was like during that remote period. It was from this setting that Dr. Leakey described his excitement when he first glimpsed the remains of Zinjanthropus man in July 1959. He said the teeth were projecting from the rock face, smooth and shining and quite obviously human. To my wife Mary and myself, who had been looking for such a clue, those bits of fossilized matter represented a priceless discovery and the end of a 28-year-old search. For there, in the rock of that remote sun-baked gorge in East Africa, lay the remains of the earliest man ever found. Now, this man is thought to have lived about 1,750,000 years ago. In 1960, Dr. Leakey discovered the remains of an even earlier man, Homo habilis, the first tool maker. Now, it is believed that he lived 2 million years ago and is the oldest direct ancestor of present-day man. These fossils, remains discovered by Dr. Leakey, are much older than the fossils of the Java man, the Peking man, the Neanderthal man, and the Rhodesian man. And because of this fact, Dr. Leakey's discoveries at Olduvai have brought him much fame and have given the world a new concept of the development of man in Africa and of the existence of past African civilizations.
Mr. Campbell, you mentioned the Leakeys searched for 28 years before they found the fossil of early man. Tell us why the remains of early man are so rare in East Africa.
Mrs. Harris, when we consider how early man lived in Africa, it is easy to understand why his remains are so rare. Now, we have pointed out that evidence indicates that early man camped near lakes or along river banks. He did not live above an altitude of 6,000 feet because the highlands were relatively wet and cold. He avoided the dark forests. In a permanent tropical climate, there was no need to retire into dark and wet caves inhabited by bats, snakes, evil spirits, and scorpions. And thus it is that the bones of those who lived out in the open were no doubt left to be devoured by scavengers. This could account in part for the rarity. Dr. Leakey asserts that men of science today are, with few exceptions, satisfied that Africa was the birthplace of man himself. And then for many hundreds of centuries thereafter, Africa was in the forefront of solving those problems that laid the basis for the creation of organized societies.
This raises the question, Mr. Campbell, as to how Dr. Leakey and other scientists are able to determine the approximate age of the oldest man.
Yes. Sonia Cole, an eminent historian of African prehistory, explains that scientists use a method known as potassium-argon dating to determine the age of fossilized remains. This method of dating is based on the rate of disintegration of potassium into calcium and argon. This rate is known to chemists. Now, that is to say, the fossil specimen would contain a certain percentage of potassium as against a certain percentage of calcium and argon. This difference is stated in years. The potassium-argon method of dating is the only method presently known for calculating absolute ages within the time range of a few hundred years back to many millions of years. And here it overlaps with other methods used for dating older geological formations. Although some scientists criticize the older one dates, they now agree that all data so far available gives no alternative to accepting an age for Zinjanthropus and for the lower Pleistocene of approximately 2 million years. Mr. Thompson, since you have acquainted us with the work of the archaeologist, what are your findings with respect to the Pleistocene period?
A degree of clarification is in order at this point, I think. Of course, those who are familiar with this subject are aware of the word Pleistocene. Pleistocene is a term adopted by the International Geological Congress to depict a certain epoch on the geological time scale. Now, from Webster's International Dictionary, the geological time chart exhibits 5 principal eras, beginning about 800 million years ago. Each era is subdivided into periods, and each period is divided into epochs. Pleistocene and recent are 2 of the epochs in the Cenozoic era. The Pleistocene epoch concluded about 10 million years ago. All happenings since then are indeed recent. The Pleistocene epoch is our immediate concern, for according to geological reports, it was the period when glaciers were receding and leaving their deposits. At this time, the so-called fourfold glaciation was probably a worldwide phenomenon, affecting both northern and southern hemispheres, causing a shift in the rain belts that brought corresponding wet phases to lower latitudes. Of great significance are the changes which were the counterpart of the ice ages in regions of lower latitudes, not directly affected by glaciation. The existence of the ice fields caused a shift in the cyclonic storms of some 15 degrees toward the north in southern latitudes. So it was that Africa experienced pluvial or rainy periods corresponding with the glaciation of higher latitudes. Mammals were the most dominant form of animal life, and the forebearers of man were just beginning to make an appearance upon the scene. This time scale may be difficult to put in proper perspective, as Robert Awdry's book, African Genesis, states. 2,000 years, however, is about as long as the human imagination can stretch without snapping. And he goes on to say, "The beach we stand on is the precarious present. It will be swallowed up before long, as other beaches have been swallowed and a new one will form just behind us. Nevertheless, geologists are familiar with a type of rocks and soil deposits that characterize the Pleistocene epoch, and such was the case at Olduvai Gorge. In addition, a chemical analysis of the soil revealed the presence of such minerals as lime, manganese, and silica in uncommonly large amounts, which may account for the thoroughness of the process of fossilization at this site.
This certainly points to the fact that modern chemistry is a valuable tool which enables the archaeologist to work for a higher degree of accuracy. This tool was not so fully developed 50 years ago, so we get a faint idea of the role time plays in the evolution of mankind. And speaking of tools, could we consider a few that possibly predate the invention of the wheel?
Yes, Mrs. Harris. Besides the discovery of Zinjanthropus and Homo habilis, the Leakeys discovered many tools used by early man at Olduvai Gorge. The study of these tools gives evidence of the Olduvan culture, which is also known as the Great Hand Axe culture. Zinjanthropus was found on a well-defined living floor with many tools of the Olduvan culture near him. This is evidence that he was a tool-making man. The Olduvan culture has long been recognized as being the oldest, well-authenticated Stone Age culture so far known in the world. Leakey asserts that this fact of itself is important, for it suggests that the African continent was the scene of the most significant step that was ever taken in the whole animal kingdom, the step of beginning to make tools to a set and regular pattern. It was this step that lifted near man from the pure animal level to that of human status. Millions of hand axes, spear points, arrowheads, harpoons, and knife blades of various types have been discovered at Olduvai and other Pleistocene sites in Africa. Among these tools and weapons are many which have been declared by experts to be the first objects of this kind ever made by prehistoric man. Evidence also indicates that the first true weapon for attack from a distance was invented by the makers of the hand axe culture in Africa. Now, this weapon was the means which helped early man to become a much more proficient hunter than he had been, and we therefore find bones of very large animals on his living floor. Cole observed that those hand axes were not only used for digging up roots, constructing game pits, but also for skinning game and chopping the meat into manageable portions. At first, near man seems to have been mainly a herbivorous mammal, feeding upon nuts, berries, edible roots, leaves, and shoots. Without cutting instruments, he was quite unable to avail himself of a large amount of food. When near man began to make chopping tools and cutting tools of stones, he opened for himself an immense new source of food and created for himself the earliest known condition of domestication.
Mr. Campbell, please elaborate on man's domestication. How did this affect his development?
By domesticating himself, early man greatly increased the speed of his own evolution. May I call attention to what happens when various wild animals are tamed to emphasize this point? When natural conditions are replaced by those which we call domestication, the mere fact of taming various wild animals have caused them to accelerate their rate of evolution. Now, this seems reasonable because taming of itself results in the setting up of conditions under which those mutants that do appear from time to time have a much higher chance of surviving to an age when they can propagate themselves than they ever had before. In becoming domesticated, early man started for himself a new phase of evolution in which the results of the natural mechanism of change were accelerated.
I must say the picture of man's early development seems clearer now. Please continue, Mr. Campbell.
Now, evidence shows that millions of years ago, people migrated to Europe as well as to Asia from Africa and carried the hand axe culture. World progress at this period also had its roots in Africa. The invention and perfection of the spearhead of stone, a type of weapon which appeared much later in Europe and Asia, is another important aspect of early human progress on the African continent. Thus, East Africa has been the center of evolutionary progress, an area of movement which later became a passageway for migrants to Europe and Asia. Long before anything was known of man's ancestors in Africa, Darwin hypothesized that our early ancestors originated on the continent of Africa. With the limited research which has taken place in recent years, it can be said that Africa's first contribution to the world was the origin of man himself. And thus, out of Africa, cradle of humanity, as Darwin called it, nature produced, of one flesh and blood, all manner of men to dwell upon the face of the earth.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell and Mr. Thompson. I still have difficulty visualizing the changes which took place in Africa during Stone Age times.
Yes, just a word of caution, if I may, Mrs. Harris. It is not logical to think that these changes took place all over the African continent at the same time. Rather, that the changes evolved much later in some places than in others and extended over many thousands of years. These cultures, tools, and movements are all very well documented in books by Dr. Louis S.B. Leakey.
Mr. Campbell, may I also list other books which we have used in preparing our discussion of this subject, Africa and the Origin of Man? Possibly others will find the reading of these books as helpful, informing, and interesting as we have. They are The Lost Cities of Africa and the African Past, both by Basil Davidson. The Prehistory of East Africa by Sonia Cole. Vanished Civilizations by Edward Bacon, and African Genesis by Robert Awdry.
In conclusion, This discussion has been primarily concerned with events of Stone Age times. Now, with the smelting of bronze and iron, archaeologists and historians have more substantial evidence to study and have produced a wealth of materials that heretofore have not been widely known.